Austria. Since getting my citizenship last week, I thought I'd make a video on this powerful country. Usually, EU4 nations are able to expand rapidly due to having good military superiority over its neighbours. However, Austria is different. Although it has a strong military, its unique power rose from diplomatic unions and political alliances during the 15th century, which is shown in EU4, most clearly seen in their national ideas. Austria has the most famous dynasty at the beginning of the game, known as the Habsburgs, that lasted for centuries. Today, therefore, we go into depth about firstly how Austria became the head of the Holy Roman Empire, leading up to the start date of EU4. Moreover, I also wanted to discuss why Austria gets such great early events, such as the Austrian personal union with Hungary. And finally, we're going to talk about the downfall of Austria's dynasty, the Habsburgs. Which, let's just say, the cause was certainly an internal matter rather than an external. They're not exactly the best looking family you'd see in the 15th century, and probably couldn't get many dates.
Nice.
Also, before we get into this, we are less than a few hundred subscribers away from 60,000 subscribers. So if you love hearing about inbred dynasties like the Habsburgs, why not help us out to get to that YouTube milestone and subscribe? Okay, shameless plug over, let's get into this. We initially begin with identifying the date at which Austria became under Habsburg control. It begins in the late 13th century. The Habsburgs were initially a really unpopular house within Austria. Local nobles believed that this dynasty was simply too powerful, and so they united against them. Despite all the backlash and uprisings, the Habsburgs managed to hold on to the territories and gain more hereditary land as time moved. But disaster struck in 1379. With the Treaty of Neuburg. After the death of the Habsburg leader Rudolf IV, his two brothers, Albert III and Leopold III, decided to govern together, ironically signing this agreement when they could no longer stand each other. This therefore caused the Albertinian-Leopoldian split when these two Habsburgs separated into their respective lines and controlled different territories within Austria. The division of power continued into the 15th century, with a further split in 1402. As you can see from this timeline, it's a little confusing, and there wasn't a person who ruled the whole of Austria during this time. As you can imagine, the division of territory between the family without doubt weakened Austria as a whole. Things took a change when one of the family members, Albert the Magnanimous, lived up to his name with good political marriages and was able to inherit the kingdom of Hungary and Bohemia through his father-in-law, Sigismund. With all these territories, he then tried to stabilise the region, but died suddenly in 1439. This brings us to near the start date of EU4, where as you can imagine, Austria is still an absolute mess, with a large amount of division, contrary to what is shown on the actual map of EU4. In fact, around the time of the EU4 Emperor update, there was a massive debate within the community about whether Austria should be divided into how it actually looked in 1444. Some of the community suggested Austria should be split up into 4 new nations. Austria would be ruled under Ladislaus. Styria, who would lead the Holy Roman Empire, would be ruled under Frederick III, the current EU4 Austrian leader. Sigismund, the rich in coin, would govern Tyrol. And finally, Frederick III's brother, Albert VI, would be regent of Further Austria. The community further said, Austria and Further Austria would be Styria's vassals, with Tyrol also in an alliance with Styria, making a sort of Austrian vassal swarm. Now I know what you're thinking, this is super complex, and thankfully the region got a bit of an update with the addition of a highly important Scilly, that are the diplomacy gods of EU4. I did a video on this as well that you can check out after. Given the complicatedness, it's understandable that it may be better to leave Austria as it is, and making it easier for EU4 players. But what do you guys think? Should Austria be split like some people suggest? Or is it better to leave it as it is? Moving on, so now that we know the origins of Habsburg Austria, how did Austria develop from the start date of EU4? Historically, the Habsburg dynasty owned both Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary once the Polish king died at the Battle of Varna, so at the start date of EU4. But it was more complicated than that. Given Ladislaus' young age, powerful nobles took advantage of the situation, including the head of Styria, Frederick III, who sought to use Ladislaus as a pawn Although Ladislaw technically claimed both Hungary and Bohemia, the powerful nobles of John Hunyadi and George Podiebrad basically governed Hungary and Bohemia. A few years after the start date of EU4, Frederick III was forced to give up Ladislaus by Ulrich of Scilly, and so the young boy returned to Vienna in 1453, away from the powerful influence of his senior family member, and into the hands of Ulrich, who was his uncle and was regent for his territories. However, Hunyadi assassinated the Scilly prince in 1456, believing he was simply too powerful. Although Ladislaw tried to insert authority, it was ineffective, and he eventually died of cancer in 1457. Therefore, despite the Habsburgs being very large in terms of territory, they lost a significant amount of power and influence, to the point where Frederick could no longer press the Habsburgs' claims over Hungary and Bohemia, unable to stop them from getting new heads of states, George of Podiebrad and Mateusz Corvinus. These two people would be powerful neighbours to Austria, and Frederick would battle on to try and gain power within these two kingdoms. He did also, however, have problems internally, with his brother igniting a civil war. Perhaps this could have been the end of Frederick, had it not been for the sudden death of his brother in 1463. It's clear at the beginning of his reign, Frederick was humiliated by other rival powers, and he certainly couldn't have seen what was happening to him as a success. Despite this, Austria's EU4 starting ruler became one of the longest ruling Habsburgs in history, reigning for 53 years in Inner Austria and for 58 years as head of the empire. While his reign did not go unchallenged, he nonetheless laid the foundations for Habsburg dominance. Upon his death in 1493, the Habsburg lands eventually united under one dynasty member, with Maximilian I forcing Sigismund to give up his lands in 1490. Over this time historically, the chaos of the dynastic claims to lands was even more chaotic than it was shown in the game, with constant wars of successions taking place. Perhaps a renewal in event chains is in order, to make what actually occurred more exciting and realistic, but you could argue it is simply too difficult to implement the way it happened in reality. But there are certainly some suggestions out there to make it more exciting. What do you guys think though? Should Austrian events be changed, or is it better to leave it as it is? The final thing I wish to discuss is the decline of the Habsburgs, and quite simply, it can be summed up in one word: inbreeding. Because of the Habsburgs' fear to losing territory and power, they decided to keep it within the family a little too much. If you take a look at the most inbred Habsburg king, Charles II of Spain, his ancestors married their first cousins, second cousins, and uncle-niece marriages. It was reported that Charles was so ugly that he scared his own wife. He also had a number of health complications, and was totally dependent on those around him. Inbreeding is one of the main downfalls for the Habsburg, and it led to the Habsburgs eventually having a series of ineffective rulers, who could do little about their physical and mental attributes. So, the moral of the story is, don't marry your family. Because of the constant inbreeding, the male lines eventually died off and forced the creation of a House of Habsburg-Lorraine. Unfortunately, this new house would never see the power and prestige that it once held, as they were overtaken by rival houses such as the Bourbons. The Habsburg-Lorraine house would continue to be at the helm of the Holy Roman Empire up until it dissolved in 1806, and would govern Austria and her states up until the collapse of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire in 1918. But all that is beyond the scope of this game. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed understanding a bit more about Austria, and why they are so dominant when it comes to personal unions in EU4. So, will you maintain the Habsburgs as a prominent family of Europe, and dominate the continent through clever diplomacy and skillful family politics in EU4? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe as well. I intend to do more content like this, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye for now.